All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last session of the day, which is the most exciting session of the day. We are here today to talk about Global Gas 2023, Europe, Asia, and supply security. My name is Samantha Carl-Yoder, and I will be your moderator today. And I would like to introduce our wonderful panel, Ambassador Dick Morningstar, who's the founding chairman of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. Toby Rice, who is president and CEO of EQT, one of the largest US natural gas producers. Alex Booth, head of research at KPLER. And Hiroshi Hasegawa, who's executive director of Japan's External Trade Office here in Dubai and a special advisor to METI. So everyone, welcome. We're going to jump right in. So if we're looking at 2023, we see so far at the winter, the 2022-2023 European winter has been relatively mild, which is key as Europe is seeking to reduce its reliance on Russian gas supplies. And in Asia, we have had the recent opening of China as the reduction of their COVID restrictions has been taking place, and there's a presumed economic boom that's going to be happening over the course of this year. On top of this, you have an energy market, particularly a natural gas market, that is relatively tight. You have tight LNG supply and no new FIDs expected until 2025, 2026. On top of that, further, you have the loss of 70 BCM of Russian piped gas to Europe, which of course creates further constraints on the markets. So we have a really interesting scenario going into 2023 on the natural gas side. But Ambassador Morningstar, if I can start with you. Given the tight market supply, how do you think the market is going to prioritize the European markets versus the Asian natural gas needs?
Well, you know, it's a question, what do you mean by prioritize? Because, you know, I think the market is going to determine where the gas goes.
Okay.
And that if demand during 2023 increases significantly in Asia, which I think is a real question mark as to whether it will or not, but if it does, then that's going to have an effect on price, and Europe is going to have to compete on price with what might be higher Asian prices. This year, it's worked out pretty well from a European standpoint. We'll see if it does next year. I do have some question how much the demand will increase in Asia during the next 12 months. And you know, China will slowly come out of its pandemic lockdowns and so forth, and the economy should grow by the end of the year. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the market, and we'll see what happens.
Okay. Hiroshi-san, your views from Asia. Who do you think is going to be sort of the key market driver? Is it going to be European energy demand and the fact that there's no Russian gas supply to sort of counterback that? Or is it going to be the economic boom that we're projecting to see in Asia and China roaring back into the world?
Yeah, everything. And it is very difficult to foresee the market, but if I may introduce the number, in the Asian demand for LNG, 2022 decreased by 38 million tons compared to 2021. And on the other hand, in Europe, there is an increase of demand for LNG, 38 million tons, so almost offset by to each other. So the next year, if the China relaxes the COVID-19 policies, or there is a bad climate, bad weather in the Europe, there will be some distortion or disturbance about all. And my point is that it's not like this year or next year. It's very important to have a long-term supply security about LNG.
Important. Alex, what I'm hearing from both of your colleagues up here on the stage is that at the end of the day, price is going to determine where these volumes go. Given where we're at, given where demand may or may not be with Asia and China, what do you think LNG prices are going to look like over the coming year?
I think one of the key things for the market is that we should expect lower volatility, and that's ultimately what so many different players, whether ultimately traders in the longer run, suppliers and consumers require in the market, is lower volatility and a bit more stability there. I think there is still a lot of uncertainties. Yes, Europe for sure has been thrown multiple lifelines, whether it's, as you mentioned, demand from the lower weather, warmer weather in Europe or in reduced demand in China. We should be able to come out of this winter with higher inventories. So we'll be in a better position than we went into the winter anyway. That will reduce that volatility. The problem is that we can't rely on that going forward. So we need to maintain those inventories into next winter at an earlier stage so that we keep that security of supply next winter.
I mean, one could argue that the reason why Europe has such a significant amount of storage supply is because they were able to buy Russian volumes before they went off the market. You don't have that going forward. So how are you able to reduce that volatility then if you don't have that supplier, that 70 BCM of piped gas that was available for the European market?
So to Ambassador Morningstar's comments earlier, we are relatively pessimistic around the rebound in Chinese demand. Okay. So that kind of demand reduction we think will continue longer into the year. Yes, as we move out of Q2 and into the second half of the year, we should see a bit more of a rebound there. So we'll have a bit more breathing space to be picking up those volumes. We've also, through the work that's been done through the last 6 months, the import capacity has been picking up and it is continuing to grow as well. So the ability to absorb any excess tons is there. And I think Europe is just going to have to take advantage of that. There's also other sources of supply of energy. We're talking a lot about gas and LNG. The French nuclear capacity or available capacity has been very diminished through this year. That's coming back online. That's going to be a big impact year on year. And we also can't forget coal. We're seeing kind of expansion of coal mines in Europe as we speak. So that is very much there. And we're also seeing a strong rebound in China as well in terms of the coal production side of things.
It's very interesting as we talk a lot about decarbonization and the fact that we need to move towards cleaner fuels, energy transition, that you bring up coal. I think we'll get to that in a bit. But Toby, I want to actually just ask you a question on where you see prices and how that affects the U.S. market, how it affects, and frankly, how does it affect the domestic market in the United States, which is certainly, there's always rumors, is the U.S. going to cut off exports of LNG because domestic prices are too high? What do you think is the outlook for that?
Yeah, I'll save the comments on the international pricing because I think these guys did a good job covering that. But as it relates to the United States, when you look historically, as the United States started LNG exports in 2016 through today being the world's largest LNG exporter, there's no correlation between LNG exports and price. The bigger driver that we see in the United States is our ability to get the critical infrastructure we need to the markets. And this is why, unfortunately, we've got some markets in the United States that have a higher correlation to European gas prices than in the area that we produce in Appalachia, which is a couple hundred miles away. I'm talking about the Boston markets and up and down the East Coast. It's kind of shocking and alarming. So for us, when we think about what can we do to lower prices for Americans and set the table for a low-cost base of LNG to serve the markets around the world, it's very simple. We need to get more pipeline capacity in the mix. I'd say, stepping forward to 23, let's look at what we learned in 22 because we talked about decarbonizing. What was the big lesson we learned in 2022? Number one, energy security matters just as much as our environmental ambitions. And the second lesson learned is you cannot meet your energy transition ambitions unless you have a foundation of energy security. Because we're talking about bringing back coal in Europe, and coal use around the world is skyrocketing. And in the last 12 months, emissions from coal have essentially risen to a level that has wiped out all the emission reductions, all the emissions benefits that we've gained by installing renewables over the last 15 years in the United States. Think about that. 12 months of not addressing foreign coal has wiped out 15 years of renewables in the United States. We've got to fix this, and we hope going forward the United States will start asking a bigger question: what can countries do to lower emissions outside of our borders? what can countries do to provide energy security outside of our borders, and U.S. Increasing our LNG capacity is going to be the answer for us to do it.
So the U.S. LNG capacity is certainly something that has been talked about being the world's largest exporter. President Biden earlier or last year made a very strong commitment to the Europeans that he would be ensuring that U.S. LNG would go to Europe to help meet the European energy demands. Given where things are going, given that the United States is not a country that really has the ability to tell companies what to do, how does he fulfill that goal? I don't know, Ambassador Morningstar or Toby, if you want to take a shot at that one. But how does he tell U.S. companies you must make sure that Europe's energy demands are met, while at the same time there are long-term contracts to Asian partners?
Yeah, with great difficulty. I'm not, frankly, I'm not sure how he does it. There is a bully pulpit. All things being equal, he can say, gee, you know, better to ship to Europe. And I think there probably, among many, is a desire to ship to Europe, given the Ukraine situation. But I don't think companies are going to take significant discounts in order to do it. I think what you just were saying about increasing the need to increase capacity is absolutely critical, but that's not going to help in 2023.
That's right.
It'll help 2025, 2026, 2027. So, you know, it's going to be, there are going to be a whole lot of factors. And going back to your original question with respect to China and Asia, demand in Asia will not be the only factor. It's one significant factor, but you know what Europe does to reduce its demand, luck aspects like weather. All of these things and maybe other things will play a role in what price will end up being in Europe because of what the demand would end up being in Europe. So you know it's a complex set of variables that will determine this.
And I think weather, to a degree, obviously it affects demand, but I think to a degree it also affects supply. One hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, and what does that mean for the ability of U.S. LNG to actually get out of the market? Right. So we're talking about price. We're talking about Europe, and you know, obviously we've seen with Russia sanctions, there's been price caps on Russian oil. The Europeans have not gone down that path at this point yet of price caps on Russian gas. Obviously, they cut off Russian gas, piped gas. But they did just last month, right before the holiday, decide to place a price cap on natural gas imports sort of across the board. And Alex, I'd like your thoughts. How effective is this price cap really going to be at the end of the day? And then does it make it potentially, if prices go higher, does that mean that U.S. companies or frankly any exporter then decides to go to the Asian market?
Yeah, we were discussing earlier how there's the potential for the correction, and it can assist in the short term. But on a long-term basis, the impact that it has, as you say, from incentivizing imports can be detrimental. The complex nature of what we're looking at in terms of the mechanism for that, for those price caps on TTF, and the mitigating factors of when they do and when they don't kick in, make it it's an incredibly difficult mechanism to bring together. I think there are also some mitigating factors around a lot of the disconnection or the strength in TTF has been around import capacity. Now, that's something that we have been working on. So you've got this disconnect between the LNG price in Northwest Europe versus the TTF. Now, as we enable more LNG to onshore, then we should hopefully be seeing less of a need to have the cap kick in. But yeah, in the longer term, it's not going to be great for the market. And we can move it. You can move the exchange.
Sure. So throughout the day today, I think folks in the audience have also heard there have been varying views about the role of Russian gas in the future of Europeans' energy mix. So I'd love thoughts, those who want to, but I'm going to point to Ambassador Morningstar here. What do you think the role of Russia's energy, of natural gas, will be in Europe in a post-war scenario? Is Russia going to be raring back to go into the market, and were the Europeans going to accept them with open arms?
Well, I hope not much. And, you know, it's a hypothetical question, and we don't know what the circumstances of a post-war situation would be. I think one thing is for certain. I cannot believe that Europe will ever let itself again be dependent on Russian gas. Now, does that mean that there would be not a molecule of gas going to Europe? That depends a lot on what a post-war, you know, we talk about post-war, whenever that may be, what a post-war scenario would be. Is there a change in government in Russia? Is there a change in behavior in Russia? Again, any number of factors. So I would never say never that there would be, you know, no molecules if Russia competes fairly, decarbonizes gas, has change in behavior or change in regime or whatever. But the main point is never, ever to be dependent again.
Yeah, as it relates to Russian selling gas to Europe and whether they're going to be dependent or not, you know, Europe may not have a choice. And I mean, comes to a rock and a hard place, storage runs dry, you've got a cold winter. I mean, what do you do? Hopefully, you never have to be in that situation to make that call. But we need to recognize we need to do everything we can to prevent Europe from being in that situation. And fortunately, with the United States, Europe does have a choice. We have the ability in the United States to quadruple our LNG exports and to over 500 BCM. Combined with the 100 BCM we do now, that's over 600 BCM we can put on the world stage. That amount of energy will displace Russia volumes 2.5 times over. That's a choice that we can make.
That assumes that there's actual LNG receiving terminals in Europe to actually bring that gas in.
Yeah, I think that the LNG receiving terminals are actually the short pole in the tent. The big cost is really getting the LNG facilities built and the pipeline infrastructure, and of course the capital needed to drill the wells. That's why we need Europe and the United States to work together to sign up for these long-term contracts so that we make this a reality. And we talk about how impactful this is going to be from providing energy security not only to Europe but to the rest of the world. This amount of energy on the world stage is the energy equivalent of over 10 million barrels a day of clean energy. That's going to be a decarbonizing force. That is the equivalent of adding a Saudi Arabia worth of clean energy to the world stage. That is going to bring unprecedented energy security, not just to Europe, but to the whole world.
So there are 14 U.S. projects in the continental United States that are in various stages of FERC approvals. How many of those actually go forward?
Great question, and that's one of the amount of projects that have been FERC approved have been a lot higher than I think people think will actually get built.
You have pipeline capacity constraints to actually,
yeah, so
you can't build those all. You don't have enough pipelines to actually get the gas to those terminals.
Yeah, and when we think about, I'm going to use U.S. metrics for a second. When we think about the ability for the United States to increase production about 50 BCF a day, that would cover the amount of permanent and proposed LNG facilities right now. We have the gas. The question is, where is that gas coming from, and can it get to the areas where it needs to go? The Gulf Coast area, we think, has the ability to sort of double their current production capacity, but the majority of this gas supply that we have, this low-cost, clean, decarbonized gas supply, comes from Appalachia, over 70% of it. So we need to figure out how we can get our natural gas from Appalachia down to these LNG facilities. One simple idea would be, instead of building pipelines across the country, we just go right next door and build an LNG facility on the East Coast. And that will be the ultimate. I think pipeline infrastructure has been a challenging place now, but I think in the future it's going to be signing up for long-term demand, which could be the long pole in the tent. Good news is that's something that we can control.
That's perfect in terms of my next question. I'm going to throw it over to Alex, actually. So we keep hearing long-term contracts. Obviously, from a U.S. perspective, you need long-term contracts in order to really solidify that financing needed for construction. But Europe's view on long-term contracts is that they don't want them. So what does this mean? And then, turning over to Hiroshi-san, doesn't that provide an ample opportunity for Asian countries that are willing to sign long-term contracts? So is Europe going to get on the long-term contract train again, or?
Well, I mean, we haven't seen it yet, and this is the thing. If we look at the the deals that have been signed through the course of the last year, there's very little in Europe, and it really is focused in Asia, and it's very much focused in China. There've been a lot of deals signed for imports into China. What's interesting is that they're taking volumes that aren't necessarily destination restricted as well. So we've already seen how China is then reselling these cargoes into the market as well, and they're heading their way back into Europe. But I think it's been discussed quite a few of the sessions through the day. There just isn't that willingness yet, and that's going to be a real hamper on that longer-term supply into the market.
It'll be interesting to see if there's enough pressure that they have to change the position, or if, as Dita Juul-Jorgensen said earlier, perhaps this actually accelerates the energy transition to renewables in Europe. But on the Asian side, how willing are Asian countries to sign long-term contracts, and is there still a need within the current Asian demand for long-term contracts?
Yes, definitely. Japan is the first country to establish LNG import. Before 50 years ago, there is no market about LNG, and that's supported by the long-term contract. But at that time, we have a kind of national electricity company that enabled to make that long-term contract. And now, as Ambassador mentioned, this is a very difficult time because of the because many companies, and as well as the Japanese government, are committed 2050 carbon neutral, and in that sense, the simple long-term contract would be difficult. So I just introduced what Japanese government is doing is that the combination of the policy measures. The one is that, as you mentioned, we try to make the destination of the LNG as flexible as possible on the contract basis, supporting by government. This is by, for example, the private company's contract. And we recently amend the law, related to law, so that the Japanese government itself could buy the LNG on the back of the national support, national financial support, in real emergency cases. And also, we are considering a new system about buffer, strategic buffer LNG. It's kind of, how to say, kind of stocks for the LNG. But it's very difficult to compare to the oil, because it's difficult to preserve long-term for the LNG, in particular for LNG. So we can apply what we have done in the oil reserve. So we have to make a combination. And also, the diversification of LNG source is primary, because Japan's self-sufficiency energy rate is only 11%. And it's worse among the G7 countries, and it's 37 among the 35 OECD countries. So we are really interested in a stable energy supply, and to meet that, the long-term contract is very important. Yes. And this is about LNG, and considering that the 2050 carbon neutral, at the same time, it is very important for us to show firmly how to make the whole energy supply be decarbonized, combining with CCS or converting it to the hydrogen or ammonia. This is what Japanese government is doing now.
Perfect.
Just a couple of points, just on the question of long-term contracts. I mean, I've thought about and wondered, you know, the people who make these contracts, you know, they're just people who are negotiating contracts. And they're not dumb people. I used to do it. Generally. And it seems to me that creative people can come up with ways to deal with the long-term contracts. I mean, you can have a long-term contract and you could have, I don't know, opt-outs or various conditions, so forth and so on, that maybe could protect both parties. One other point, just to go back for a second to your Russia question, and will there ever be Russian molecules? Because I think your point of increased capacity is absolutely critical. But you also said earlier, when we were talking, and the green transition may make of the demand for gas less over time. So we have to look at it in terms of time frames and somehow balance increasing capacity with the speed of the energy transition. Now that leads to questions like the potential for stranded assets and so on, which is constantly comes up. I think that's also smart people can work some of those things out. That a stranded asset may be a cost of the energy transition, just like other costs of the energy transition are. So, maybe there are ways to work that out. So,
Can I add to that? Because I think when you think about long-term contracts, a little uncertain of what the future is going to look like. But with the energy that you're procuring, it needs to be cheap, it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be clean. On the cheap aspect, being proactive and signing up for these LNG deals is going to allow you to sign up for a project, and from a cost perspective, to get away from the spot market where utilities have gone bankrupt playing the spot market. We can put gas on the doorstep of Europe for a cost of $12, and that would imply a $4 gas price here in the United States. At that price structure, our industry can deliver this LNG to your doorstep and make modest returns, and $12 natural gas at your doorstep is an amazing deal, especially relative to the $20 that people are seeing right now. From a cost perspective, that should not be a reason why you should not want to do it. Reliability, United States delivering LNG, from where we're at, it's going to be a very safe, secure route, backed by the U.S. government and the U.S. military. And the third thing I'd say is on the clean nature of it, this is really where I think people have some hang up, is that yes, natural gas is cleaner than coal, but it still has a carbon footprint. Well, you're assuming that this industry is not going to be able to transform itself. There was a crisis that we dealt with 20 years ago. It was the United States was running out of oil and gas. And what did we do? We transitioned. We transitioned from drilling conventional reservoirs to unlocking shale. And the innovation that took, the risk-taking, the collaboration, hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, that was a miracle. And we cracked the code on shale and became an energy powerhouse. This industry is pointed, and here's the call for clean energy. Here's the call for zero carbon energy. And I believe that our industry is going to make natural gas a zero carbon solution, whether through hydrogen, whether through carbon capture, or whether through other methods like ammonia or carbon offsets. I bet that is going to be a much better feasible path so that natural gas will be the perfect energy solution, cheap, reliable, and a zero carbon energy source.
I want to remind the audience that we are actually open for audience questions. We have somebody who has a microphone that can walk around, but if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, interrupt us. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Well, let's turn to Asia. We spent a lot of time on Europe. As we know, President Xi has recently relaxed China's COVID restrictions, but all signs, maybe not in China, but certainly the news coming from around China, is that China is going to be hit pretty hard by COVID, at least in the short term. So Alex, in your research, what do you see the Chinese economy doing this year, and then how does that impact or not their energy demand?
So we think that 2022 will close out probably under 3% growth year on year at a macro level. So compared to plans, compared to history, very, very poor. Projections for this year are better, but still, again, not great. We're talking 3.5%, 4% through the year as a whole. But as I was mentioning earlier, that's really skewed into the second half of the year. We think that there's going to be a lot of difficulty coming out of the situation at the moment as COVID is running through the country. Then we move into Lunar New Year very soon as well, and things will be ramping back up, and we need to see actually how the great movement of people within China through New Year again potentially has an impact to keep COVID running. Where we see that growth is also very interesting because it depends on which energy sector is effectively benefiting from it. So obviously there's big increase in movement of people, so certainly transportation fuels, without a doubt, we will see an improvement in oil demand, again, as we move through the year. But then if we look at the housing industry, the construction industry, there's a backlog of property, the retail sector that needs to be churned through. That we think is going to take quite a long time to get going. So We don't think that we'll be seeing that strong rebound in the construction industry, so that heavier industry is hurt. And then the last to come as the country really gets going is the broader heavy industry. And that's where you have the potential for the gas to really come back into play. So I think it will be delayed. I think there's probably a bigger impact on the oil side than there is on the gas side. And as I was saying earlier, coal production was up 10% year on year in China. So they've had to move into other energy production fuels as well. So there are some out there with a very, very bullish view on Chinese rebound. We're not quite there. Yeah.
And Hiroshi-san, how do you see sort of broader Asian demand, not necessarily just China, but I'm thinking Southeast Asia and also South Asia? Are you seeing pockets of demand for increased energy, increased LNG? Do you think that because of prices, the coal market is going to continue to be sort of high in demand? What are you seeing from an Asian perspective?
Yes, I mentioned about the decrease in demand this year, and most of them are China, but other parts are Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Pakistan, and they couldn't buy LNG because of the hike of the price. It's like 3 times, 6 times higher compared to the 2019. So based on the price and based on the economic situation, the demand will be increased. And also in the long term, the many private research companies foresee the demand increase in the LNG as a whole, and in particular among the Asia. So we will see the increasing demand for the LNG and natural gas in Asia. And at the same time, because we have a lot of supply chain and have a good relationship with Asian countries like ASEAN and China and other countries, so we try to make up at the same time ensuring the energy security, stable energy supply, and the decarbonization. And we are trying to support the Asian countries in terms of finance, technologies, and human development, so that supporting short-term LNG and maybe mid-term, long-term hydrogen and decarbonizing fossil fuels.
Very bullish on Asian energy demand growth over the next 5-10 years, certainly. But if we're looking at 2023, and we assume that LNG and natural gas volumes are constant, and there are projections for at least increased utilization, I think, in Europe. Alex, tell me, do you think that European incentives for businesses and private individuals to reduce consumption, do they work? Will they continue? Or do you think at a certain point in time, the European government's going to say, okay, we have enough in storage, we're going to let this go? Or are they thinking about next year?
I think that the issue that you have is to think of Europe as one large block when ultimately it's lots of different countries that have approached this in very different ways. I think in Spain, they've only seen something like a 2 or 3% decline in demand, whereas in Germany, it's 17% decline in demand. Now, the work of the governments and how they have changed their responses to high prices has been very different. Ultimately, that means the consumer behavior at the retail end of the spectrum has been very different. I think if we're thinking at the industrial end, though, there is we talk about an active demand destruction in Europe, and I think in many areas, we were talking about this earlier, it's far from active. It's the fact that actually, no, businesses can't afford to run. Mm-hmm. So you've had whole industries that have essentially shut down their manufacturing capacity because they cannot afford to run their business with the gas prices as they are. Now, that's even with support from governments in different levels. Looking at the UK specifically, just more kind of current in terms of the exposure I have, we have been looking at, there are quite frequent changes in the scheme of things into the support that's going to be provided. So it's actually very hard for industry to plan what they're going to be doing going forwards if they don't know exactly what support they're going to be having in 6 months' time, 12 months' time, 18 months' time.
And coupled with inflationary pressure, global recession, governments are sort of in a conundrum of having less money to be able to actually incentivize people to reduce their utilization and encourage companies to actually produce and manufacture and sell when consumers don't have the money to actually purchase. So you get into this sort of vicious cycle where at the end of the day, are you left with what behavior?
Yeah. And what's really remarkable is like the ripple effects of, I mean, this energy efficiency gains, this is not people turning down their thermoses. This is them turning off industry. I mean, 30% of their industrial demand is off. The ripple effects of that do not just impact Europe, they impact the entire world. One of the first things that shut off was the fertilizer manufacturing. What happened to fertilizer prices went through the roof. How has that affected crop yields? Guess what, just a hint, they're down. Does that mean food prices are gonna stay up? Possibly. Could that lead to famine in some parts of the world? Yes. I will say this, I think it's a really important point. As long as we're talking about developed nations struggling to find their energy security, when developed nations are fighting for their energy security, or they don't have their energy security, no country has their energy security. That means 3 billion people are still living on less electricity than it takes to run a fridge. That means 60% of Americans that are living paycheck to paycheck are going to struggle with unnecessarily high energy prices. So the biggest, most impactful thing we can do for the world is prioritize our energy security, and that is going to allow us to leapfrog leaps and bounds towards our energy transition ambitions. But make no mistake about it, I believe firmly that natural gas is going to be a central part of any energy security or any transition plan.
You know, all of this raises a question. You asked the question about Asia, outside of China, outside of Japan, and talk about increasing energy demand in places like India, and I think you mentioned Pakistan, and we had hoped to have somebody from Bangladesh on this panel. Mm-hmm. Where's India going to get its gas from if their demand increases? I had been involved with for years with the so-called TAPI pipeline. If anybody, some people, Doug Engel's laughing out there. Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, and what I said about that pipeline was even more than what I said about the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline. Not during my lifetime. I'm getting too old though, so I'm beginning to worry a little bit. But the idea of a TAPI pipeline going from Turkmenistan all the way to India, is that realistic? If demand increases in the developed countries like China, Japan, Korea, in Asia, no matter what we do to increase our capacity in the United States, we can't supply all of those countries plus Europe. They're going to have to be other, any number of other sources. So I think there really is a real question, as to how countries like India and then lesser developed countries, including in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, where the gas is going to come from.
Yeah, Dick, I think unleashing American energy and unleashing U.S. LNG in the world stage and putting essentially 10 million barrels a day of clean energy on the world stage is going to be a great first start. And it's something that we have control over and we can do. Just need more support and collaboration to get pipelines built and the long-term contracts to get the facilities built.
And one thing we haven't really talked about, and I think, Alex, you might be going there, is
sorry.
there are other markets outside the United States that can increase capacity.
Yeah.
You have, the recent agreement between Israel and Lebanon potentially unlocks, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head in terms of TCF, but, volumes from the Eastern Med, coupled with Israel, Cyprus, you've got gas in the Eastern Med, you have Norway certainly increasing its production, and someone earlier talked about the need for the North Sea to increase its production. And obviously, Qatar being Qatar, talked earlier about where its volumes are going and the fact that I think, frankly, most of them are going to Asia. But Toby, let me turn to you.
Well, no, I wanted to touch on South Asia because I think it's a super important area. I mean, it's literally stuck between Europe and Asia in terms of supply, in terms of their security of supply, whereby last winter we had situations, and again, long-term contracts don't help them because we had situations where cargoes weren't being delivered despite them being committed, because ultimately it was easier for the company to pay the penalty of not delivering and send that cargo into the spot market in Europe than it was to deliver a long-term contract into, I think it was Bangladesh and Pakistan. That's a massive problem.
Do you see that potentially happening again in 2023 if we're looking
Well,
at the...
ultimately those contracts are there, and it was a legitimate thing to do. I think the question is, do we get back to, if we return to that price environment where the European spot market is there, I think it's less likely because, say, there are other mitigating factors these days. But again, it's a very large part of the global economy that we're just saying, nope, sorry, you're not getting that LNG, and then they have to go to alternative fuels. We're looking at, again, we're talking about coal going to fuel oil for power burn as well. It's kind of these high carbon intensity, dirty fuels because we can't get the gas in there.
Any, Mr. Hengel? Yes, please.
This is, I think, primarily for Toby, but so you talk about natural gas being a clean fuel, and I would agree it is. Sorry, I'm ducking with LNG allies. But there is a narrative out there that natural gas is as bad as, or could be as bad as coal because of methane emissions. And you've been a leader in this space, but is the industry as a whole, do they understand this, that this is an issue that has to be addressed to change that narrative?
Yeah, methane emissions certainly is the biggest environmental concern over natural gas today. I was at a meeting last year with Secretary Granholm, and I told her straight up, I said, we're going to knock methane emissions out of the park, keep the bullseye on methane emissions. Why was I so confident? Because in natural gas development, we know where these emissions are coming from. We know we have equipment to replace them, and we can do it cost effectively, and we can do it efficiently and expediently. In the last 18 months, we've been on a campaign to replace those pneumatic devices, and we've replaced over 9,000 of these devices across our portfolio. So the largest producer's footprint in America, 9,000 devices replaced in over 18 months. We did it, that's doing it fast, and we did it for a cost of $28 million. That's less than $10 a ton. It's the most impactful thing that you can do if you want to cut your carbon footprint. And the impact, we slashed our methane emissions by over 70%. Over 300,000 tons of CO2e equivalent. So it's really smart, and we put a white paper on our website so that if we can do it, anybody can do it. And just this last week, we announced that we're going to be bringing even more confidence to the environmental performance. Now we're moving to the skies with the emissions monitoring, so not just on the field, but with satellites and aerial monitoring so that we can have bulletproof credibility that the performance that we're putting out is there. All this is really important because we need to show the world that the emissions associated with making our product are going to be net zero, and we can focus the conversations on what are the emissions when people use our product. That's where we need to be. And every BCF a day that the world can use and that replaces foreign coal is going to have the environmental equivalent of lowering emissions by over 30 million tons. And our plan, if we can fully execute this and unleash US LNG on the world stage, we'll have the environmental equivalent that's bigger than the impacts of IRA. It will be the environmental equivalent of electrifying every vehicle in the United States, putting solar panels on every house in America, and also doubling US wind capacity combined. It's absolutely massive. And if we need to take care of methane emissions so that we can focus the conversation on big prize, then that's exactly what we're going to do in this industry. I'm really excited about the progress we've made.
Fantastic. Well, we have 2 minutes left. Are there any more audience questions? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Mohammed Shakil from ADNOC. I'm intrigued by the long-term contract discussion. And a question for Hiroshi-san. Just to put you on the spot a little. Exactly 12 months ago, almost, Japan let its long-term contracts with Qatar expire, through JERA especially. And then a month later, we had the Ukraine war. What was the discussion initially within Japanese thinking to allow those long-term contracts to expire, given what we're saying now about how critical long-term contracts are? And then looking back, was it a mistake?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. And basically, JERA is a private company, private gas importing and coal-fired and gas-fired power plants company. And that was a private company's deal. But as a government, we always diversify, and we don't deny any energy sources. And in order to do that, we think that some kind of long-term stable supply, and as I mentioned, we cannot do that because the JERA was like before the nationalized companies before. So becoming JERA, the older company made a long-term contract with Qatar and other LNG exporting countries. But now we are considering the other policies now. And maybe we can introduce sooner. Thank you very much.
So the role of LNG, tight markets going into 2023. I think what we're hearing is that certainly the Europeans will continue to buy as much LNG as they can, but at the same time are also looking to utilize other sources of energy, whether it be, unfortunately, coal, whether they look to have a nuclear conversation, whether Dita Juul-Jorgensen's comments about energy transition being accelerated are correct. I think, here we would also argue that Russian molecules, not in 2023 at least, but beyond that, still remains to be seen. The Asian market, certainly China is a question about whether the demand is actually going to be there. Certainly the demand is there from Northern Asia, Japan, Korea, as well as the Indias, the Pakistans, the Bangladesh. And so I think what we're going to see in 2023 really is going to be a fight over whatever cargoes are available on the spot market. You're going to have a question of LNG pricing at the end of the day. Markets are going to determine where those volumes go. The European price cap on gas imports may come back to bite them at the end of the day, but we will see. I want to thank our panel for this fantastic conversation. Really appreciate your views, and thank you to our fantastic audience.